On today's installation video, I'll be showing you how to install a RaceChip on a McLaren M838T engine available across many of McLaren's models. Before installing the RaceChip, please wait until your engine is cool enough to work on. Put your parking brake or emergency brake on. If your vehicle is equipped with an alarm system, please disable it. Pop the hood, roll up the windows, close the doors, and press the lock button on your key fob and move that key fob 30 feet away. You're gonna wait about 10 minutes after for all the electricity to clear from underneath the hood. The first step is to pop the rear cover on the engine to expose the oil and coolant fill nozzles. In here you will find two T25 fasteners that need to be removed. To remove the engine cover, we're going to lift up slowly and then pull back. You'll need to unplug the light if you have the Spider or the 570S model. Now we're going to remove the manifold jacket. To do so, we're going to pull up and release the metal clamp. We now have access to all four of our sensors. Our A connections are going to our boost pressure sensors on either side of the engine. Our B is going to be underneath the manifold jacket, going to the manifold pressure sensor. Our C is going to the transmission temperature sensor in the back driver side of the vehicle. And our D is going to the camshaft position sensor on the passenger side front of the motor. To unplug the OEM sensor plug, we're simply going to push down on the locking tab and gently pull back. Then we'll take the male end of the OEM sensor and plug it directly into the female end of the RaceChip wiring harness before we take the male end of the RaceChip wiring harness and plug it into the OEM sensor. We'll now do the exact same step on the other side. Please note if you have an issue unplugging these sensors, sometimes gently pushing in while you push down the locking tab can help to remove them. Now our B connections go into our manifold pressure sensor. Once again, if you pull back the manifold jacket, you can get better access to this sensor plug. Just like the A connections, we're going to unplug the male end of the OEM sensor. We'll then take the male end of the RaceChip wiring harness and plug it directly into that OEM sensor, making sure it locks in place before we take the female end of the RaceChip wiring harness and plug it into the OEM male end of the sensor plug. Then we'll go to our C connection, which is going to our transmission temperature sensor. To unplug the OEM sensor, we're going to push down on the metal locking tab and then pull back. Then we'll plug the female end of the RaceChip wiring harness in, making sure it locks in place. Before we take the male end of the RaceChip wiring harness and plug it directly into that OEM sensor. Again, make sure it locks in place. Now to gain access to the D connection, going to the camshaft position sensor on the Spider, we're actually going to remove the turbo piping going from the intercooler into the throttle body on the passenger side. And if you look in the back, you'll be able to see the camshaft position sensor with the orange O-ring around it. To make sure nothing works its way inside the motor, we do recommend placing a towel or a rag inside the throttle body and the intercooler. Now, we're going to reach our hand back and plug in the female end of the RaceChip wiring harness into the OEM sensor plug and making sure it locks in place before we take the male end of the RaceChip wiring harness and plug it into the OEM sensor plug. With all four of our connections securely made, we're going to go ahead and zip tie the wiring harness. Now with the McLarens, the engine base can get very hot, so it's important to make sure that the wiring harness and cables stay away from any hot and moving parts, including the exhaust as well as the transmission. Now we're going to mount our four mounting tabs onto the back of the RaceChip unit itself. The really nice thing about these mounting tabs is you can mount horizontally or vertically, and if you ever need to remove the RaceChip for any reason, you can push down on the outside of the locking tab to remove the unit but leave the wiring harness. Now we're going to remove the deactivation plug. Hang on to the deactivation plug. Do not throw this away. And then we're going to install the RaceChip directly into the harness. Now it's really important that if you have the GTS Black, you get no LED to illuminate on the screen the very first time we install the unit. We don't want any power going to the RaceChip when we're installing for the very first time. Make sure when mounting the RaceChip unit, just like the wiring harness, we stay away from any hot or moving parts. Now we're going to reinstall the turbo piping between the intercooler and the throttle body and retighten the hose clamps around the turbo piping. Now with everything securely mounted and away from all the hot and moving parts, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the engine cover, and if you have the Spider, make sure that you plug back in the rear brake light. Start in the default setting of the RaceChip for the first time you test drive the car. If everything works great, you can then move the RaceChip to the next level up. Be aware that the car needs some time to adapt before releasing the full performance upgrade. Now, get out, drive, and enjoy your RaceChip.